Winter Everest doesn't forgive. It doesn't even wait. When the jet stream drops, when temperatures become unsurvivable, and when the body fails faster than the mind can process, every mistake is permanent. Today, we're breaking down the first deaths of 2026 on the world's highest mountain, and why they prove once again that Everest remains the deadliest peak on Earth. It was January 2nd, 2026, and the Himalayan winter had settled over the Khumbu Valley with brutal efficiency. Everest's summit pyramid rose 29,032 feet above sea level, its upper reaches obscured by a constant plume of wind-driven snow that extended for miles downwind. The jet stream, that river of 200-mile-per-hour winds that normally hovers above the peak during summer months, had dropped directly onto the mountain's face. Temperatures at Camp 4 on the South Col hovered around minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit before wind chill, and weather stations showed gusts exceeding 120 miles per hour on the summit ridge. The sky above the Khumbu was a hard, metallic blue, the kind of color that only appears when the air is too thin to hold warmth or moisture. Down in the valley, prayer flags snapped in the wind, and the icefall groaned with the slow, relentless movement of the glacier beneath. Among the handful of climbers on the mountain that week was Dmitry Volkov, 44, a Moscow-born energy consultant who had spent 2 decades identifying vulnerabilities in Siberian pipeline infrastructure. He approached mountains the way he approached industrial systems, methodically, with redundancies for every variable. Colleagues described him as obsessively prepared, someone who trusted equipment and planning more than he trusted his instincts. He had completed winter ascents of Khan Tengri and Peak Pobeda in the Tian Shan range, enough to believe he understood extreme cold at altitude. At Advanced Base Camp on the northern side, at 21,300 feet on the Tibetan Plateau, a single expedition tent stood against the wind. Inside, Dmitry checked his oxygen equipment for the 14th time that morning, his breath crystallizing instantly in the frigid air. Dmitry carried a custom down suit rated to minus 70 degrees, supplemental oxygen sufficient for a 36-hour push, satellite communication devices linked to a support team in Kathmandu, and emergency bivouac gear that could sustain life for 2 days at extreme altitude. Every piece had been tested in controlled conditions that approximated the challenge ahead. What his preparation couldn't account for was the gap between simulation and reality at nearly 30,000 feet in January. Dmitry departed Advanced Base Camp at 2 a.m. local time, moving into darkness so complete that his headlamp seemed to create a small bubble of existence surrounded by infinite black. The temperature had stabilized at minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit with winds of 40 miles per hour, conditions his team in Kathmandu described as a weather window that might last 18 to 24 hours. The first several hours went according to plan. Dmitry moved steadily through the intermediate camps, his conditioning evident in the rhythm of his movement. He reached the North Col at 23,000 feet as the first gray light began illuminating the peaks to the east, pausing only briefly to adjust his oxygen flow and consume calories. His GPS showed consistent progress, and satellite check-ins were clear and focused. He moved past abandoned tents half buried in rime, reminders of climbers who had turned back or never returned. The problems began above 25,000 feet, in the zone where the human body starts dying regardless of acclimatization or equipment. Dmitry's pace slowed dramatically as the altitude took hold, each step requiring conscious effort that consumed mental resources he would need later. The wind had increased beyond the forecast, gusts now exceeding 60 miles per hour and creating wind chill temperatures that pushed past minus 80 degrees. His custom suit performed admirably, but the cold found gaps, the interface between his goggles and face mask, the junction where his gloves met his sleeves, the exposed patch beside his nose where moisture created ice crystals that burned like acid. At 26,500 feet, Dmitry made his first critical error. His oxygen system, functioning perfectly at lower altitudes, began showing irregularities as ice formed in the regulator mechanism. Rather than descending to address the issue, he increased the flow rate to compensate, burning through his supply faster than planned. The decision seemed logical in the moment. He was only hours from the summit, and turning back now would waste months of preparation. His hypoxic brain processed this calculation, without recognizing that the math was already working against him. The summit ridge, above 28,000 feet, presented conditions that exceeded his worst projections. The wind had built to sustained speeds of 70 miles per hour, with gusts approaching 90, creating a horizontal torrent of ice crystals that sandblasted exposed equipment and reduced visibility to mere feet. Dmitri pressed forward, his world narrowing to the next step, the next handhold, the next breath of bottled oxygen that tasted increasingly thin as his supply dwindled. He reached the summit at 1:47 p.m. local time, 11 hours and 47 minutes after leaving advanced base camp. The achievement should have been triumphant. At 44, he had just become one of fewer than 20 people to summit Everest in winter. Instead, he felt only exhaustion and a growing awareness that something was wrong. His oxygen gauge showed less than 4 hours of supply remaining, and the descent would take at least 7 hours under optimal conditions. The conditions were not optimal. The descent began immediately, but Dmitri's pace had slowed to a fraction of his climbing speed. Each step required coordination that his oxygen-starved brain struggled to provide. His fingers had lost sensation despite the heating elements in his gloves, and his communication with the Kathmandu team became increasingly confused. When asked for his location, he reported coordinates several hundred feet from where his GPS showed, a disconnect the support team recognized as severe cognitive impairment. At 27,800 feet, Dmitri stopped moving. His last transmission came at 4:23 p.m., a garbled message the support team couldn't clarify. His GPS tracker showed him stationary on a small ledge below the second step, exposed to wind now screaming across the ridge at sustained speeds exceeding 80 miles per hour. The temperature that night dropped to minus 52 degrees Fahrenheit on the upper mountain, with wind chill values that exceeded standard meteorological calculations. Dmitri's body was discovered 3 days later by a search team that could only approach when conditions moderated. He was found in a seated position, his back against a rock outcrop, his oxygen mask still attached to tanks that had been empty for more than 60 hours. His satellite phone was in his hand, the battery dead. The last attempted call time-stamped at 5:17 p.m. on January 2nd. The investigation concluded that Dmitri Volkov died of hypothermia and hypoxia sometime between 6 p.m. and midnight on January 2nd, 2026. His equipment had functioned within design parameters, but conditions had exceeded those parameters significantly. The weather window had deteriorated faster than forecast, and his oxygen consumption rate during the summit push had left him without reserves for the descent. The danger wasn't dramatic. It was 20 degrees colder than forecast. It was January 5th, 2026, and the same weather system that had killed Dmitri Volkov 3 days earlier had finally begun to break apart over the central Himalayas. The jet stream was lifting, and forecasters detected a potential window that might allow summit attempts from the South Col route. At Everest Base Camp on the Nepali side, at 17,600 feet, a British expedition team was preparing to take advantage of conditions that remained extraordinarily dangerous, but had improved from impossible to merely extreme. Leading that team was Thomas Ashworth, 36, a mountain guide from the Lake District who had built his reputation on technical competence and conservative decision-making. He had summited Everest twice during the spring seasons and logged extensive time on 8,000ers, including K2, Broad Peak, and Makalu. Colleagues knew him as someone who turned clients around at the first sign of trouble, prioritizing safety over summit statistics. His decision to attempt a winter climb had surprised those who knew his careful approach, but Thomas believed experience could bridge the gap between seasons. His team was small and well-resourced. 3 experienced climbers, backed by a reputable logistics company that provided weather forecasting, medical support, and emergency evacuation planning. They had spent 6 weeks acclimatizing and preparing, establishing camps and caching equipment along the standard South Col route. What nobody appreciated was how winter had altered familiar terrain in ways spring experience couldn't predict. The team departed base camp at 11 p.m. on January 4th, timing their movement through the Khumbu icefall for the coldest part of the night when the ice would be most stable. Their breath formed clouds in the beam of their headlamps, and every carabiner that touched the glacier rang with a sharp, brittle sound. Old ropes frozen into the ice marked the route, some so stiff they barely bent as climbers clipped past. The cold was more intense, the silence more complete, the glaciers creaking more ominous than Thomas remembered from spring. They cleared the icefall without incident, and reached Camp 1 at 19,900 feet as dawn broke. The weather was holding, though high clouds to the northwest suggested the window might be shorter than forecast. Thomas made the decision to push immediately for Camp 2 rather than resting, a choice that would save time but consume energy reserves that might be needed later. The climb to Camp 2 at 21,300 feet revealed the toll that winter was taking. Despite his experience, Thomas moved more slowly than expected, his breath more labored than it should have been at altitudes he'd handled comfortably before. He attributed it to extreme cold, forcing his body to burn additional calories to maintain core temperature, but something else was happening. A headache had begun behind his eyes during the icefall, a dull pressure he dismissed as dehydration and altitude adjustment. He had experienced headaches on every Everest climb and learned to manage them with fluids, rest, and ibuprofen. But this headache was different. It didn't respond to his usual remedies, and it intensified with each hour. By Camp 2, the pain had become constant, interfering with his thinking and making simple logistics feel overwhelming. His teammates noticed. Thomas was normally decisive, the person who kept expeditions running smoothly. But at Camp 2, he seemed confused, asking the same questions repeatedly and struggling to follow conversations. When one teammate suggested altitude sickness, Thomas dismissed the concern with uncharacteristic irritation, insisting he knew his body and would recognize any serious problems. The team rested at Camp 2, but Thomas slept poorly, awakened repeatedly by a headache that had evolved to sharp, stabbing pain. He vomited twice, attributing it to something he'd eaten, rather than cerebral edema increasing pressure inside his skull. When the team prepared to depart for Camp 3 at 1 a.m. on January 5th, Thomas insisted on continuing despite symptoms any objective observer would have recognized as dangerous. The climb to Camp 3 would normally take 6 to 8 hours. But Thomas's pace had deteriorated dramatically. He moved in slow, uncertain steps, frequently stopping and occasionally losing balance on terrain that should have been routine. His speech had become slurred, responses delayed, and often irrelevant. The symptoms of high-altitude cerebral edema, HACE, were now obvious to everyone except Thomas himself, whose impaired judgment was itself a symptom of the condition, killing him. At 23,800 feet, Thomas collapsed and could not immediately rise. His teammates helped him to his feet, but he could no longer walk without support. A decision had to be made: continue toward Camp 3, still hours away, or retreat toward Camp 2, closer but requiring navigation of technical terrain with a semi-conscious patient. The weather was deteriorating, clouds building to the west and wind increasing on the upper slopes. The team established an emergency bivouac and called for helicopter evacuation, a decision that might have saved Thomas if conditions had cooperated. But Winter Everest doesn't cooperate. The helicopter dispatched from Lukla could not regain altitude due to thin air and increasing winds. A ground rescue team from base camp would take at least 12 hours, and the weather window was closing faster than anyone had anticipated. Thomas's condition deteriorated rapidly. His consciousness fluctuated between confusion and complete unresponsiveness. His pupils became unequal, a sign of increasing intracranial pressure, the edema progressing toward brain herniation. His breathing became irregular, periods of gasping followed by pauses that lengthened as the night wore on. He stopped breathing at 2:34 a.m. on January 5, 2026, while his teammates performed CPR in their emergency shelter. Their efforts continued for over 40 minutes, but at 23,800 feet with limited oxygen and no medical equipment capable of addressing brain swelling, resuscitation was never realistic. Thomas Ashworth was declared dead when his teammates acknowledged what had been true for nearly an hour. The investigation confirmed that Thomas had developed high-altitude cerebral edema sometime during the climb from base camp to Camp 2, likely triggered by inadequate acclimatization to winter conditions far more demanding than spring climbing. His decision to continue despite obvious symptoms had allowed the edema to progress to a fatal stage. The condition is treatable if recognized early and addressed with immediate descent, but Thomas's impaired judgment, itself a symptom of the disease, had prevented him from making the decision that could have saved his life. It was January 8, 2026, and social media was already telling the story of Everest's deadly first week. The same system that had killed Dmitry Volkov and Thomas Ashworth had continued to weaken, and forecasters detected what appeared to be a genuine window forming over the summit. At Camp 4 on the South Col, at 26,000 feet, where the world's highest mountains give way to nothing but sky, one climber was preparing to add his name to the growing list of January casualties. Brennan was 29, a fitness influencer from San Diego who had built a business on adventure content and supplement endorsements. His feed was a curated collection of extreme experiences: skydiving, shark diving, ultramarathons, each post projecting fearless capability to his 2.3 million followers. Everest was supposed to be the ultimate addition to his portfolio. Friends noticed he talked about the climb in terms of content value rather than personal challenge. The summit wasn't a goal, it was a deliverable. His climbing experience was limited but real. He had summited Kilimanjaro, Aconcagua, and Denali over the previous 3 years, each climb documented extensively for his audience. His technique was adequate, his conditioning excellent, and his determination to succeed on camera unwavering. What he lacked was the hard-won wisdom that comes from years of close calls, the understanding that mountains don't care about follower counts. His expedition was organized by a guiding company, specializing in clients with more ambition than experience. They were reluctant to accept a winter booking, but Kyle's payment and insistence overcame their reservations. They assigned him 2 experienced Sherpa guides and provided equipment exceeding standard requirements, hoping that support could compensate for conditions. The climb to Camp 4 had tested Kyle's capabilities, but not exceeded them. He moved more slowly than his Sherpa guides would have preferred, but he kept moving. His oxygen consumption was higher than average, and his technique showed room for improvement. But he reached the South Col in condition to attempt the summit, if the weather held. The weather was holding, barely. Winds were still strong by spring standards, but had dropped to levels that experienced winter climbers considered manageable. The temperature at Camp 4 was minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit, brutal but not unprecedented, and visibility was good enough to navigate the route to the summit. Kyle departed Camp 4 at 10 p.m. on January 7th, accompanied by his 2 Sherpa guides. The climb through the night went reasonably well, though Kyle's pace was slower than his guides had hoped. He reached the balcony at 27,600 feet as dawn broke, then continued upward toward the south summit and the final ridge to the top. The summit push required every ounce of determination Kyle possessed. The wind sculpted the snow into knife-edged ridges, and the sun, when it finally rose, offered no warmth, only a blinding glare off the endless white. Each step above 28,000 feet felt like moving through syrup. The altitude crushed his breathing into shallow gasps that never seemed to provide enough oxygen despite the supplemental supply. The cold penetrated his expensive suit in ways he hadn't expected, finding seams and gaps that manufacturers had assured him didn't exist. His fingers and toes had gone numb hours ago, a condition he recognized as concerning but couldn't address without stopping. And stopping at this altitude meant potentially never starting again. He reached the summit at 9:23 a.m. on January 8th, 2026, becoming one of the youngest Americans to climb Everest in winter. The moment should have been pure triumph, the culmination of years building toward this content opportunity. Instead, Kyle felt only exhaustion and an immediate desire to descend before his body failed completely. But first, he needed footage. The decision to remove his gloves for a photograph would later be identified as the moment his survival timeline began its final countdown. Kyle wanted to capture the summit marker with his bare hands visible in frame, proof that he had actually reached the top. His Sherpa guides protested, warning that exposed skin would freeze within seconds at these temperatures, but Kyle insisted it would take only a moment. He had done this before on other summits, and the content value was worth a few seconds of discomfort. The photograph took longer than expected. Kyle's camera had been affected by the cold and responded sluggishly to his commands. His bare fingers fumbled with the device, trying to frame the shot correctly while the wind tore at his body. 15 seconds became 30, then 45, then over a minute as he struggled to capture an image that met his standards. When he finally replaced his gloves, the damage had already been done. The frostbite was immediate and severe, affecting all 10 fingers to varying degrees. More critically, the process of removing and replacing his gloves had disrupted the thermal equilibrium of his entire hand system, allowing cold to penetrate deeper than his gloves alone could address. Within 30 minutes of leaving the summit, Kyle realized he could no longer feel or effectively control his hands. The descent became a nightmare of deteriorating capability. Kyle could not manage his equipment properly. Struggling with carabiners and rope systems that required dexterity, his frozen hands could not provide. His Sherpa guides took over as much as possible, clipping and unclipping his safety systems while he focused simply on moving his feet. But on Everest's final ridge, there are moments when every climber must manage their own equipment, and Kyle's increasing incapacity was creating dangerous gaps in his protection. The fall happened at 27,200 feet, on a section where fixed ropes require clipping between anchor points. Kyle attempted to manage the transition himself, insisting he could handle it despite his guide's offers to assist. His frozen fingers could not properly secure the carabiner, and when he weighted the system, it failed to hold. He slipped, then tumbled, then began sliding down the steep face toward the 8,000-foot drop into the western Sidwim. His Sherpa guides reacted instantly, one diving to grab Kyle's harness, while the other braced against the fixed line. The arrest was violent but successful. Kyle's slide stopped after approximately 40 feet, his body suspended by his harness while his guide stabilized. For a moment, it seemed recoverable, but the fall had caused additional damage. Kyle had struck his head against an ice formation during the slide, and while his helmet prevented a skull fracture, the impact caused a concussion that compounded his already impaired state. When his guides attempted to help him stand, he could not coordinate his movements. When they tried to guide him along the route, he could not follow instructions. He had become dead weight at 27,200 feet, and there was no realistic way to carry him down. The hours that followed were a desperate attempt to save a life, already beyond saving. Kyle's Sherpa guides constructed an emergency shelter and called for support, but the logistics of high-altitude rescue in winter made meaningful intervention impossible. A helicopter could not reach their position. Ground rescue from Camp 4 would take hours, and Kyle's condition was deteriorating faster than help could arrive. His core temperature was dropping as his body diverted resources from extremities to vital organs, and the head trauma was causing increasing confusion and loss of consciousness. Kyle Brennan died at 4:47 p.m. on January 8, 2026, approximately 7 hours after reaching the summit he had dreamed of conquering. His Sherpa guides remained with him until the end, providing what comfort they could as his body systems shut down one by one. The cause of death was recorded as hypothermia, secondary to incapacitating frostbite and head trauma, a cascade of failures that began with a photograph and ended with a young man dying on a mountain that had never cared about his follower count. The investigation found no equipment failures or guiding deficiencies. Kyle had been warned about the danger of exposing bare skin, had been offered assistance with his equipment, and had been provided with every reasonable support. The decisions that killed him were his own, made in pursuit of content that would never be posted. The danger wasn't dramatic. He was removing his gloves for a photograph. 3 deaths in the first 8 days of 2026. 3 experienced adults who believed they understood Everest's risks and had prepared accordingly. Their stories joined the mountain's long memory, where the wind erases footprints, but never the consequences. The mountain didn't change. The altitude, the cold, the risks, all remained the same. What changed was the presence of human beings who believed preparation could overcome what the mountain had already proven to be lethal. Dmitry Volkov had the equipment, but not the weather. Thomas Ashworth had the experience, but not the judgment. Kyle Brennan had the ambition, but not the wisdom. Everest in winter is not a challenge to be conquered. It is an environment that tolerates human presence only briefly and punishes mistakes with absolute finality. The first deaths of 2026 were not anomalies or surprises. They were the predictable result of human beings entering a space not designed for human survival and discovering that the mountain's rules apply equally to everyone who dares to climb. Thanks for watching. If you like these stories, click here.